All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am. So, time to say good afternoon for some of you, although good evening, good morning, good middle of the night for others tuning in from all over the world. And welcome to this edition of PON Live from the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. I'm Nicole Bryant. I'm the managing director here at the Program on Negotiation. And as many of our regular viewers and attendees will know, the Program on Negotiation is a research group based at Harvard Law School, but drawing on the research and expertise of faculty and researchers from not only the law school, but actually all of the schools across Harvard, as well as our sister consortium schools, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Tufts University. And for 40 years now, we have led the world in events such as this one, teaching for both students and executives, and pedagogy and curriculum on the topics of negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And that means that we regularly put on free, live, 1 hour events such as this. The recordings of all former events are up on our website, and we're very pleased to be able to offer those to our community members. It also means that we are regularly teaching to folks from all around the world. And right now, as we speak this week on campus, we have about 100 senior leaders from all corners of the world joining us for a week of intense study on negotiation and leadership. And we are so pleased to be hosting them at Harvard this week. For our topic today, we will be examining the second edition of the book, Negotiating the Impossible, with apologies because this is actually the first edition. The second edition comes out today, and I will be getting my physical copy soon. A work by Professor Deepak Malhotra of Harvard Business School, who I'll be introducing in just a moment. Our session will take place over the course of an hour. Professor Malhotra will be presenting for about 40 minutes, and then we'll leave about 20 at the conclusion of the session for questions and answers. If you have a question at any time, please drop it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. This session is being recorded, which means that if you need to step out for any reason, if it gets too late wherever you are in the world, if you have to take another call, or if you want to rewatch the recording or share it with a friend, you will be able to access it on the PON website in just a couple of days. As ever, I'd like to thank the incredible PON staff who does so much work putting on these events: Laura San Pietro, Diane Long, Riley Schretzel, and Luis Reyes. I am very thankful to them for all of their hard work behind the scenes. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Deepak Malhotra, who is the Eli Goldstein Professor of Business Administration at Harvard Business School, as well as a member of the Executive Committee of the Program on Negotiation. He is a celebrated professor who has received numerous awards for his teaching and scholarship, and the author of several books, including Negotiating the Impossible, our topic today. Deepak, thank you so much for closing out our academic year with our last event of June. We are very pleased to have you, and we look forward to learning from you today.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very kind introduction, and I really appreciate everybody who's joined us here today. As mentioned by Nicole, we're going to be talking about negotiation, and more specifically, as you can see in the topic title, Negotiating the Impossible in the Age of AI. Negotiating the Impossible, of course, being the subject of the book, and the age of AI being what every one of us is living through as we speak. And so what I'm going to try to do is spend a little bit of time on each of these aspects. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the core ideas from the book, things that you might want to have some takeaway value from the moment you leave this Zoom. And then talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on and the lessons learned from it. So Kilmer AI is an expert advisor on negotiation that I've been building with a technology team over the last 8 to 9 months. And the idea of trying to get a AI agent to have negotiation expertise has been both an exciting journey and an extremely difficult one. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what makes it hard. And I'm going to talk along the way about what foundation models in AI get right and don't get right. What is the nature of expertise, especially as it pertains to negotiation? And then talk a little bit about how these things come together. As mentioned by Nicole, I'm also happy to answer as many questions as I can take in the time that we have allotted. I'll speak for about 40 minutes, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, and then I'll take as many questions as I can and be as efficient as I can about them. So feel free to start sending those in sooner rather than later, and we will get going on all of those as soon as I get done speaking on this. So to get us right into the topic at hand, Negotiating the Impossible is a book that I wrote a few years ago. And the basic idea here was that there are a lot of books out there on negotiation. Every one of them that I've come across has been of value. But one of the things that I thought was perhaps still needed, or perhaps a different perspective was needed on it, was thinking about our toughest negotiations and what are the things that sometimes people miss. And the book itself is organized into three different sections. And the three sections that I'm going to go through very briefly here are all aspects of negotiation that should not be a shock to anybody who's studied the topic or has read a book on negotiation. But the book tries to go much deeper strategically and tactically into these different dimensions and really highlight the importance of how success versus failure often hinges on getting these things right. And the first part of the book talks about the power of framing. Now, framing is a lot of things. Um, to put it most simply, getting framing right is about understanding that it's not just what you say, but how you say it. There's an old anecdote where there are two monks and they're talking to each other, and one monk says, "You know, I asked the abbot if I could smoke while I pray, and he said no." And the other monk says, "Well, that's weird because I asked the same abbot if I could pray while I smoke, and he said yes." And when you just look at that sort of obviously stylized example, immediately you get the sense that there is a difference between effective and ineffective communication. And part of the power of framing looks at making sure that you are thinking carefully, not just about the question you're asking or the statement you're making, but how is it going to be received? What's going to light up in the other person's mind? What kind of barriers is it going to create, or what kind of opportunities are they going to see in the way you communicate your message? So some of framing is about that. But to think of framing simply about the sentences you use actually misses the most important aspect of the power of framing. Effective negotiators are very good at framing the entire negotiation in a more advantageous way. Think of framing as a psychological lens through which the other side is looking at you and looking at the negotiation and looking at what their role is in the situation. There is no right or wrong frame, but there are advantageous and disadvantageous frames for you. And so if you're going to be negotiating a deal and you walk into a situation and the person sees you as weak or desperate, things are going to go differently than if they see you as comfortable and confident in what it is that you are doing. Some years ago, I was advising an early stage technology company. It was early stage. It had gone through a few rounds of VC funding. It was gone through maybe a Series B or a Series C. And they were negotiating their very first strategic partnership with a very big player, a Fortune 50 company that pretty much everybody on this webinar would be familiar with. They're negotiating this deal. And I would say the most important thing we ever did in the entire 8-month process of negotiating this huge strategic partnership was on day one during our strategy session when I said to the team, this is our team, I said on day one, as we go on this journey, as we go through this negotiation, the number one thing we're going to have to keep in mind at all times is that Company X being the big company we're going to be negotiating with, Company X does two kinds of partnership deals. One, it does partnership deals with companies that it considers its peers, its equals. And two, it negotiates partnership deals with companies that it looks at and thinks these people should feel lucky just to be in the same room as us. And Company X treats these two kinds of partners very differently. When they look at you and they see a peer, somebody who's an equal, the kinds of demands they make, the kind of strategic rights they ask for, the kind of process they put you through is very different than if you walk in the room and immediately what they're thinking is, man, these folks should feel lucky just to be in the same room as us. They just hit the lottery being here. Now, all of a sudden, the demands they're going to make, the process they're going to put you through, the strategic rights they're going to ask for are going to be very, very different, even when you control for the total value that you as a partner are bringing to the table. So part of controlling the frame and understanding the power of framing is understanding that the same exact negotiation could be framed as a negotiation among equals or as one party being seen as lucky to be here. Now, of course, there's a problem here. Just because you have a preferred framing doesn't mean you get to just walk in on day one with the other side and say, hey, by the way, we know this is an important negotiation for everyone. We just want to make sure that the framing here is of equals, not lucky to be here. Can we all agree that we're not lucky to be here? That's not really how you're going to control the frame. That would be sort of an awkward way to try to do it. And so, for example, in this case, we had to work a lot harder to get the right frame set up, and we had to start early because frames get established early, and the longer they have taken hold, the harder they're going to be to change. If somebody's seen you a certain way for a very long time, it's going to be hard for you to change their perception of you. So you have to try to control the frame early. So in this case, for example, and I would say most people I've ever advised on negotiations, and I've advised, hundreds of organizations now on negotiations, most people would probably tell you, I'm not the kind of person who gets hung up on minor things that are not that material. I don't nickel and dime where it's not that relevant. But in this case, we made a bit of an exception. Anytime the other side approached us with something that we thought was being stated or presented differently than it would if it was done to an equal, we pushed back. If they sent us an MOU, an LOI, some deal terms, a contract, a proposal, an email, where the language was such that we thought it was lucky to be here, not equals, we would push back whether it was material or not. So if there's language that seemed asymmetric, like let's say a clause that they're proposing about what happens if all of a sudden we go out of business, what are their rights in those kinds of situations? If there's a insolvency situation, what's gonna happen? Well, we would take that provision and we would make it symmetric. We'd make it two-sided, even though they were much less likely to become insolvent. Similarly, if they said to us, we'll get back to you on Wednesday morning with a go or no go decision, and Wednesday morning came and they didn't call, we didn't pick up the phone late Wednesday morning, or Wednesday afternoon, or Wednesday evening, or maybe even Thursday morning. That's the kind of thing somebody who feels lucky to be there, who's desperate for the deal, might behave. So we had to discipline ourselves and say, okay, how would somebody behave who would actually feel comfortable knowing that if value is going to be created here, we don't have to be so nervous about it? Those early investments pay dividends downstream. When as the weeks and months go by, they become conditioned to seeing us not as somebody who will do anything they say, who will agree to any kinds of demands, who will jump through any kinds of hoops just to get a deal, who doesn't just feel lucky to be here, but somebody who feels comfortable and confident in the value they bring to the table. And the last thing, last example I'll give about framing is about something that every one of us does in negotiations at some point. At some point in your negotiation, you're probably going to have to make some concessions. In most negotiations, most of the time where progress is made, there's going to be some give and take, and there's going to be some moving from initial positions. When you make a concession, typically what you're hoping is going to happen is you're going to make a concession, the other side's going to appreciate it. They're going to think of you as being perhaps empathetic and nice and considerate. They're going to think of you as maybe smart and sophisticated for knowing that some give and take is necessary. And as they think of you as smart and nice for doing this, they're going to feel obligated and make some concessions on their end as well. But there's a problem. Every concession you ever make in a negotiation can be framed in many different ways. It can be perceived in many different ways. That same concession may look smart, nice, empathetic, caring, considerate, sophisticated, or that concession might be perceived as weakness or desperation or naivete. You want the attribution the other side is making to be smart, nice, sophisticated. You don't want them to see you as weak, desperate, or naive, because if that is the perception they have of your concession, not only are they going to be less likely to want to reciprocate or feel obligated to reciprocate, they might decide to tighten the screws even more because it seems like they can get an even better deal. So one of the pieces of advice, which is sort of part of the power of framing, just one small element of it, is to get into the habit of labeling your concessions. So when you're making concessions, label your concession. Now, labeling your concession doesn't mean every time you make a concession, you point to it and say, by the way, that was a concession. Please put a C next to it. It's not like label it in that way. Label your concession is just a way of reminding ourselves that when we make a concession, to whom we make a concession, and how we make a concession, we should be thinking through how will they perceive it, given when, how, and to whom we are making this concession. And be mindful of that as you make your concessions so that you maximize the likelihood that you avoid being seen as weak, desperate, or naive. So, for example, in negotiations, sometimes there will be a concession I'm willing to make. There's a concession that I'm willing our side to make. But I will say, listen, we're willing to be flexible here, but not right now. Not today, not under the current conditions. Not with a gun to our head. Not in a situation where if we were to make a concession now, it could only be perceived as desperation or weakness. Maybe we're the ones who made the last concession or two. And now if we're to make another one unreciprocated, it would send the wrong signal. Or maybe they've behaved badly. Maybe they've been bullies. Maybe they've been threatening. Maybe they've behaved in an unethical way. And we would be rewarding that kind of behavior by being flexible on something today. because we don't just care about the economics of the deal, we also care about the psychology of the deal. Power of framing becomes an important component of this. So whether you think about the statements you're making, whether you think about how the entire negotiation is framed, or whether you think about how your actions are going to be interpreted, understanding the power of framing is a very important component of being an effective negotiator. It doesn't mean the give and take and the economics of the deal are not important. The numbers matter, the value on the table you're creating matters. Of course, those things are essential, but effective negotiators also understand how to leverage the power of framing, and the book gets a lot into that. The second thing the book focuses on, the sort of the second main section of the book, is on the power of process. So first, what do we mean by process? Well, let's sort of distinguish between process and substance. The substance of the deal is things like what goes in the contract. When you're negotiating substance, you're doing things like making an offer, making a counteroffer, making a concession, thinking about whether to walk away because your reservation value or your bottom line number has not been met. You're talking about deal terms. That's the substance of the negotiation. The give and take, the offers, the counteroffers. Process is not the things that will eventually go into the agreement. Process is everything that gets us from wherever we are today to the finish line. And the finish line might be a signed deal, or it might be the implementation of the deal. It depends on the kind of negotiation we're talking about. And effective negotiators don't just strategize on the substance. They don't just think about what's my walkaway point, what should my opening offer be, what concessions am I willing to make, what concessions am I going to demand. They don't just strategize the substance. They also strategize what would be the most effective process. And they also negotiate process, not just substance. Like framing, there's no right or wrong process universally, but there are advantageous and disadvantageous processes for you in any particular negotiation. And effective negotiators make sure that their strategy includes strategizing on process. And I would go as far as to say, in most situations, I advise people to get into the habit of negotiating process before substance. Before you dive too much into the substance of the back and forth, make sure you understand, coordinate on, and if possible, shape the process itself. Uh, I'll give you an example. Imagine you've been negotiating a deal for a very long time. It's been like 2, 3, 4 months. But for a deal like this, it's a right amount of time. It's a reasonable amount of time. And you finally get to the point in the negotiation where you feel like a deal seems possible. You can see the finish line. You think a deal might happen. No guarantee, but things are starting to look hopeful. You decide this is a perfect time to make the one or two last concessions you have saved up in your back pocket. You decide this might help seal the deal. So you decide the timing is right. So you take out this last one or two concessions and you put them on the table. And the other side looks at you and says, wow, this is great. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. This really makes a difference. Now, if you don't mind, let me just take everything we've been talking about and share it with my boss and see what she has to say about all of this. And you're like, I'm sorry, what? Wait, you have a boss? Wait, I thought we were done. Wait, what happens next? I don't have anything more to give. This would be an example, again, a bit of a stylized example of a situation where you failed to strategize on, think about, and negotiate process early. And it might cause you to have made substance mistakes during the negotiation. Negotiating process before substance means things like finding out from the other side early on. Hey, how long does it take an organization like yours to do a deal like this? Who are all the parties that need to be on board? What are some things that could happen in the days and weeks and months ahead that would slow things down? What are some things that might happen that would speed things up? Process before substance is also more micro things like, hey, who's going to be in the meeting tomorrow? What's going to be on the agenda? What about these other things that we care a lot about? When are we going to get to those? Effective negotiators think not just about the substance of the deal, they think about the framing. They don't just think about the substance of the deal, they also think about process. As one last example of the importance of process, as sort of a subcomponent as you think about process, is what are we even here to negotiate? What is even the scope of the negotiation? Effective negotiators don't take the frame as given, they shape it. They don't take the process as given, they try to shape it if they can. They don't take the scope as given, they try to shape it. If the scope is too narrow, if you're just butting heads over some zero-sum divisive issue where nobody wants to give, sometimes the right strategy is not to just get more aggressive, but to put more issues on the table. Try to entertain more of each side's interests, broaden the scope, expand the scope of the negotiation so more value might be able to be created. Other times, that's the opposite. of what you want to do. Sometimes the scope is way too wide. You're trying to negotiate too many things. And given the resources you have, either political capital, social capital, time, it's just intractable. You're never going to get this deal done. You're trying to do too much and you need to narrow the scope. So again, what we're trying to say here is that as an effective negotiator, the less you take as given, the more effective you're going to be. And the more things that you see are relevant to negotiation outcomes, not just the economics of the deal, but the psychology and the politics and the process and the scope, the more likely you use those levers as well. And the last section of the book spends a lot of time on the power of empathy. And here again, I mean empathy, not sympathy, not just caring about other people, but being able to see the world the way other people see it. And all of the ways in which that can be one of the most powerful ways to unlock deals, to overcome deadlock, to deal with disputes, to find a way forward when nothing seems possible. People walk into negotiations with many different kinds of mindsets. If you were to ask me, I think the most effective, the most powerful mindset you can have in a negotiation is a learning mindset. In my view, you are there above all else to learn as much as you possibly can about all of the parties that are relevant to the negotiation. Not just the people in the room, anyone who can influence a negotiation or is influenced by the negotiation. The better you understand them, the more likely you're going to be effective. In fact, everything we've said so far has as a precondition learning. How will you know how to frame effectively if you don't understand the other side? What will be a better and worse framing? How will you get the right process if you don't have a good understanding of what the current process or what's happening on their end? How will you get the right scope if you don't understand exactly what their needs are, where they might be more and less flexible? And so what I emphasize in the book and in one of the chapters of the book is what I call an ICAP analysis. The acronym doesn't matter, even the words don't matter, but the underlying idea matters. What you're trying to learn, right? You're trying to learn as much as you can. Well, learn what? I try to categorize those across sort of four buckets: interest, constraints, alternatives, perspectives. What are the interests of all the other parties? What do they care about more? What do they care about less? Why are they here today? What keeps this person up at night? Where might they have more and greater needs for certain things? What are problems that they have that I can solve? Constraints. Where do they have more and less flexibility? Are there red lines that they really can't cross? Where are their hands truly tied? The better you understand where they have more and less flexibility and where their hands might be truly tied, the more likely that you navigate the negotiation in a way that respects their genuine constraints and yet still gives you a deal that you can live with. Their alternatives. What happens to them if there's no deal? How are their alternatives changing? As the negotiation drags on, do they have more and more options or fewer and fewer? If their options are only getting smaller or only getting fewer, maybe there's less of a rush to negotiate a deal. But if their alternatives are only improving the longer time goes, maybe the sooner you want to do this negotiation. And finally, their perspective. How are they seeing the situation? How do they see you? Sort of the frame of this, the meta aspect of this. When they look at you, is this something that they're excited about? Is this a negotiation that's central to what they're doing, or is it peripheral? Is it something that they care a lot about and is core to their strategy, or not so much? The better you understand these elements, the more likely you're able to negotiate more effectively. Now, I want to do a bit of a pivot here. Let's put this in the background. We're going to revisit some of these in a moment. I want to bridge to the topic of AI. As mentioned earlier, and some of you may have joined a little bit later, I've been spending the last 9 or 10 months thinking about how to and working on building an AI agent that would able to be an expert advisor on any kind of negotiation. And already we're seeing there's so many subtleties, so many things going on in negotiation. The question is, how do you go about doing this? So if you think about AI in the topic of negotiation generally, there's a lot going on. So I'm going to sort of narrow our sort of scope to a little bit something more tractable in a short talk like this. First of all, there's a lot of things that fall under AI. Most of the things that people are talking about in the press tend to be LLMs, large language models. You might be familiar with ChatGPT or Claude or Llama or Mistral. There's a lot of sort of large language models that are out there that are being leveraged for negotiation now already. And I'm going to be talking about one aspect of that. There are other things in AI that can be very helpful for negotiations. There might be an AI tool that allows you to find synergies between your company and somebody else's company looking at their supply chains. That would maybe also help in negotiations, but it's not exactly what we're talking about here. And if you were to divide the world in terms of what is happening with regards to AI, LLMs in the domain of negotiation, there would be sort of three general areas that AI is being and could be very impactful. The first is AI as a teacher. And in fact, some of our colleagues at the program on negotiation are working on these aspects. There is a lot of scope for improving negotiation teaching using artificial intelligence. The most obvious thing is using AI to help people prepare for negotiations, to give a lot more reps in role play, to give feedback at much greater scale, and in some cases, much more nuanced and personalized. And just generally speaking, one of the promises of AI is that it can create personalized and adaptive learning. So instead of 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 people in a room having the exact same journey through a lesson, people can have a personalized and adaptive journey through the lesson. So there's a lot going on there. It's not the thing I'm going to focus on today. Second thing I'm not going to focus on too much today is AI actually negotiating on your behalf. This is also already happening. So there are companies out there that are already using agents or bots to play the role of their customer service representative, or you call Sprint or you call Delta. I'm not sure those are the two companies doing it, but companies of that kind, a lot of companies are investing in trying to substitute individuals with AI agents who can take a gazillion calls at the same time and do them in perhaps even a more systematic way. There are some challenges when it comes to using AI as an agent to negotiate on your behalf, and I'll just sort of speak to just sort of two things generally. Some of the current challenges are one, the platforms and the norms haven't fully been developed to use an agent as your negotiator. If I was going to be buying a house from you or buying your car or something, and we were getting connected on text or email, and I said, you know what? Why don't you just talk to my agent instead? And I just sent you over to a link. I think you'd find it kind of odd. So in a lot of places that the norms aren't there. In other cases, the platforms just don't exist to do that. That doesn't mean those aren't coming. So as time goes on, I think agents will be able to replace human beings in various negotiations. The second challenge, which is sort of the more interesting one to me, is that for complex or bespoke negotiations, we don't yet have the tools for training agents to do a great job. The obvious thing is we don't have training data. So if you're doing customer service calls, well, there's tons of data. Companies have 50,000, 100,000 transcripts. They even know whether they ended well or didn't end well. They've been scored in lots of ways. So there's training data that can allow you to train an agent that's doing certain kinds of tasks that are not too varied or too complex, and there's a way to make the models more effective. The other thing that's a little bit harder for more complex or bespoke negotiations isn't just that there's no training data. Human beings have preferences that are sometimes endogenous. What I even care about, how much I even care about a deal, how much I care about working with you, where I'm willing to be flexible sometimes evolves because of our human interaction, because of the human element of the relationship. It's not entirely yet clear how an AI agent would be able to represent a human being without a human in the loop in a world where preferences are endogenous, where what we even want to achieve can evolve in ways that we're comfortable with. Now, we might take the opposite perspective, which is like, hey, good job. We got AI agents, so we're not being influenced by what the other side is saying, but it does create a disconnect between what humans would do and what an AI agent would do. Now, the thing that I'm most actually interested in is negotiation expertise. It's relevant to the teacher, it's relevant to the agent, but it is most centrally relevant to creating an advisor that would be able to advise you on any kind of negotiation. There's a simple way to do this. It's not great. It's okay. The simple way to do it, it took us maybe 2 days to a week to get this going, was feed it every one of my books, every one of my articles, every speech I've ever given, transcribe, and make it somebody who can use that information to answer questions. But that's more the role of a teacher. And you can ask questions about, hey, what do you do if the other side's being aggressive? What do you do if the other side is lying? How do you know if they're lying? Should you make the opening offer? All these kinds of questions you can extract using an AI agent that wouldn't take us very long to build. But expertise is something different. And that's where I want to kind of focus the rest of my time on and talk about why negotiation and negotiation expertise and other kinds of expertise is so hard to get into an agent of this kind. So first, what do we mean by expertise? Well, in our world, we sort of differentiate between what we might call experience and what we call expertise. Think of experience as what you get when you do something over and over again. So if there's somebody who's done 10,000 real estate deals of a certain kind, or 20,000 kinds of negotiations around a certain kind of procurement negotiation, If they've done it that many times and you need somebody to help you with that specific negotiation, you're probably going to go with that person. They don't need to be a negotiation expert in any other domain. They've done this enough that they can probably do a really good job for you in the next situation as well, as long as it's not too different. So experience is what you get when you do something over and over again, and it can be valuable. Expertise is what you get when you not only have done something perhaps often, but when you actually have a strategic conceptualization of why it is you do what you do. So you can't just continually do it. You can do it again, but more importantly, you have a deeper understanding of why you do what you do. And what that opens up is a few very, very important aspects of transferability. First, you get to see the boundary conditions. When do you not do certain things? The things that you've been doing successfully, when would you choose not to do them? Well, if you've done something 1,000 times and every time in those 1,000 times it was useful to do X, you may not have a conceptualization of why you do X and when you should stop doing X if the situation shifts. It allows you then to get out of sample transferability. When you get out of that domain, you're able to transfer your knowledge because you have an understanding of the why and the boundary conditions. And associated with that, typically with expertise, is the ability to communicate, not just what you do, but why you do it. Not just how you do it, but under what conditions would you not do it. And if you wanted to get really deep, and I'm not going to go there right now too much, really deep expertise is at a level where your understanding is almost at a machine code level, where you can see the zeros and ones, and you don't get distracted by terms like buyer, seller, aggressive, liar, all these things. You can look even deeper than that, and you sort of understand how this is an interplay between parties that have interest constraints, alternatives, perspectives, and you don't have to worry too much about what's happening at the surface level. I'm gonna ignore that for now, but I will emphasize one important point. I've written a few books on negotiation. I've taught many thousands of people in negotiations, and I've given lots of lectures. None of those are actually designed to transfer expertise. They might be coming from expertise, but somebody reading a book doesn't actually immediately get expertise. And it's the same way an AI agent can't, quote, read a book or have access to a book or be able to retrieve a book and have expertise. There's something else that is happening that is not simply about reading and then doing. There's a deeper level of processing. And so you get expertise, yes, when you have all that content, but when you've also deeply reflected across many different domains using that content and thought deeply about why it works and how it works. So as we think about negotiation expertise and you're trying to create an agent or you're trying to be a negotiation expert yourself, so even if you're not interested in AI at all, some of the things I'm going to say here are going to sort of reference earlier things that I talked about in the Negotiating the Impossible section of the talk, and I'm going to start talking about it from the point of view of expertise. First of all, it's about dimensionality. Some people will walk into negotiation, and you know folks like this, and perhaps you were a person of this kind at some point in your life. You tell the person to go into negotiation. For some people, preparation and strategy is this simple. I know what I want, and here's 5 or 6 reasons or arguments for why the other side should give it to me. And I'm going to go into the negotiation, and I'm going to make my demands, and I'm going to make my arguments, and hopefully 2 or 3 or 4 of those arguments stick, and I'll get some or a lot of what I want. Well, that's a pretty narrow approach to negotiation. As mentioned earlier, your strategy and your preparation has to be multidimensional. Yes, you need to think about the substance. What's my walkaway point? What might be their walkaway point? What are all the issues we need to negotiate? What should be my opening offer? How should I ask for a counter offer? Where should I push them on? Yeah, absolutely. You need to prepare and have a strategy for substance. But as mentioned earlier, effective negotiators also think about preparing for and having strategy for the psychology of the deal, the framing of what's going to be said, how it's going to be said, how we're going to be perceived, how our actions are going to be perceived. It also needs to be able to have a strategy for process, again, as mentioned previously, and scope. Optics, something we didn't talk about before, but would also fit under the general rubric of framing. Optics is how are other people going to look at this agreement? There will be negotiations where you and the other side should both be willing to live with this deal. It's better than walking away and pursuing your BATNA, if you're familiar with that term. Or to put it another way, there is a zone of possible agreement or a ZOPA, and the offer you've put on the table is technically in the zone of possible agreement, but it's going to make them look bad. It's going to embarrass them. It's going to ruin their reputation outside of this particular situation. Well, that concern about optics might also end up killing the deal. So as you're thinking about negotiation expertise, you have to be thinking about optics as well. And the last component, which by the way, I'll touch on in a moment as to where foundation AI models are very, very bad, is continuous learning. As a negotiator, you don't just learn a bunch and then go into a negotiation and execute. A big part of what you're doing throughout the negotiation is learning more and learning as much as you can so that you can continually update perhaps your strategy, but certainly your tactics. All of these need to be part of your strategy. And so when you go to ChatGPT and ask for negotiation advice, unfortunately, it doesn't always understand the importance of doing all of these things or to do it in a way that is a composite in your strategy. The foundational elements that you need also have to be there. Again, foundation models like ChatGPT and others don't have a great conceptualization of what are the foundational elements before you even give advice on a negotiation. As I said earlier, some of it is about understanding the interest constraints, alternatives, and perspectives of the other parties. Another big part of it is mapping out the negotiation space. I use the term negotiation space essentially to describe who are all the parties that are relevant to the negotiation. Anyone who can influence the negotiation or is influenced by the negotiation should be on my map. So one of the first things I do when I'm advising a company or advising somebody in a conflict or even a non-business situation, one of the first things I'm going to do is we'll have some whiteboards. We'll map out the negotiation space. Who are all the parties that could influence what is happening here? So again, if you start strategizing, or if your advisor starts giving you advice, or your foundation model, your AI model starts giving you advice, not having thought these things through, you're going to have a problem. Another aspect of this is obsession with process. One of the things we struggled a lot with when we were looking at the models that are out there was not enough of an obsession on the part of the AI to think about where we are in the process. Where exactly are we? What's already happened? What's going to happen next? What are the degrees of freedom in changing the process, etc., and not taking it as given. And crucially, context specificity. The advice that I get from ChatGPT, because I play with it all the time, I must spend hours on it per day on average as I'm thinking about how we're trying to improve on what it does. The copy and paste advice that you get from some teachers, some advisors, some books is really problematic. What matters in any situation is what are the norms and the nuances of that context. So if ChatGPT is telling you like, oh, you're having trouble negotiating with your boss for a raise, and you ask, would it be nice to get a mediator? And the ChatGPT says, of course, get a mediator. That sounds like a great idea. No, it's probably a terrible idea for that relationship. So thinking about the norms of the situation, thinking about the subtle nuances of what's happening, and I'll talk about nuance in the next slide as well, is crucial. And so what you want to do as an expert negotiator, or what you want to do as an expert advisor who's going to allow people to negotiate more effectively, is you have to have a strategic mindset. And a strategic mindset essentially takes these foundational elements, a deep understanding about the situation, about all the parties, about where we are in the process, what makes this context different, what are the objectives, those foundational elements, and then it creates a theory of the case. Okay, what is my theory about how we get from where we are to where we need to get? And only then does it start using these elements of strategy that we talked about earlier. So there's this sort of intermediate place where you have to think about how do you put all this stuff together. And to create an agent that can do all of that is somewhat complex. Last two things I'll say here. First, effective negotiators have to have a lot of confidence and they have to have a lot of humility. Balancing these two things is not always easy for an AI to do, but it is essential for a human being to do who's going to be on the front lines negotiating a deal. If you don't have confidence, you get pushed around. If you don't have humility, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. Interestingly, these two elements feed each other. In my view, people that have a lot of confidence are the ones who have humility. They don't worry about the fact that they don't know anything. They learn. They're confident asking questions. They're confident not just settling on a strategy on day one and not updating it. They have the confidence that even as they learn more, they're only going to get better. And humility also feeds into confidence. The more humble you are, the more open you are to learning other things, the more likely you're going to get assets, learn things that are going to give you the confidence you need to be more effective. And finally, from the point of view of expertise and the point of view of creating an AI agent that has expertise, You have to remember that great strategy is not simply a collection of great tactics. Strategy should not be emergent. It should not be incremental. It should not be that at every moment of the negotiation, you did what seemed smart. You can make every decision well at any moment in a negotiation and still end up in the wrong place because you hadn't thought through early on about how are these different tactics going to come together. So strategy has to be coherent, it has to be comprehensive, it has to be forward-looking. Unfortunately, too often what's happening in negotiation and strategy of all kinds, military strategy, political strategy, business strategy, is people are making really smart decisions, but in very, very narrow slices of the journey. So the problem with base models being the models you get off the shelf. You go to ChatGPT and you start asking for negotiation advice. Well, there's two kinds of problems. There's a calibration problem and there's a capabilities problem. Existing base models, I have to say strongly enough, I cannot predict where we're going to be in a year or 5 years or 10 years, but existing base models have certain problems. I'm not one of these folks who will go around and say AI will never be able to do this. AI will never be able to do this. I have seen things that just uh, blow my mind, and I have seen things that are on the frontier of what's happening in these agents that it's pretty amazing. But currently, what we're dealing with are some problems of calibration. First of all, you ask for advice. Well, if you ask me for advice on an important negotiation and you ask me a question, the likelihood that I'll answer that question immediately is close to zero. I'm probably going to ask you 5, 10, 15, 20 other questions. And whether we have 20 minutes to advise you or 8 hours to advise you in a big strategy meeting, a lot of it is going to be me learning and me being curious. Even when you tell base models to be curious and ask questions before answering, they don't quite internalize it enough. Internalize it, I'm using that sort of not precisely. They lack humility. Everybody who's used ChatGPT has had that sense, and most other models as well. You can even tell it to have more humility, and then it will say things more humbly, but it doesn't quite understand how wrong it might be in many cases. So the humility is an issue. Strangely, or interestingly, curiously, while it lacks humility, it is also very agreeable. So the moment you tell it, wait, isn't that wrong because of this? Oh, yeah, yeah, you're right. It's totally wrong. And it'll change its advice. In fact, this was one of the most annoying things I was dealing with as we were trying to train our own models. The foundation models are so easily pushed around that you want them to be able to have some confidence and humility, and they don't seem to have both. They sort of toggle from one to the other. Extreme confidence and then pushback, and just too much humility and not willing to stand for the parts of what they were saying that maybe did make sense. And of course, there's training data problems. They're trained on all the written work that's out there in the real world, and I'm not against win-win. Obviously, it's a great concept. Let's try to create value and make sure everybody feels good about it. But the amount of stuff that's out in the internet on negotiations isn't necessarily calibrated to what you really need in some tough negotiations. And sometimes the sort of copy and paste, theoretically very nice, conceptually wonderful to hear ideas, when they get translated as strategy, end up hitting a brick wall. They end up not being very, very effective. If anything, they can sometimes even backfire because they're not nuanced and careful enough for really difficult negotiations. And on capabilities, if you're asking for negotiation advice with me and we're going through a conversation, every once in a while I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to say, oh, hang on a second, Nicole or Riley. You just said something. I want to dig in a little bit. You said they said no. Tell me exactly what they said. Did they say no? What exactly were the words they used? Other times I'm going to want to zoom out. You're going to be talking. I'm going to say, wait, I think we're getting too detailed. Can we just step back a little bit? I want to learn more about the context. Foundation models don't have good intuitions on when to zoom in and when to zoom out. Similarly, they don't always notice what wasn't said. If I've been advising people for well over 20 years on negotiations and you walk into my office and you're telling me about your negotiation situation, I'm hearing what you're saying, but I'm also hearing what you're not saying. And in the back of my mind, because of pattern recognition, et cetera, I'm thinking things like, by now, somebody would have also mentioned X. Somebody would have raised this issue. They would have also sort of discussed this. They haven't done that. I wonder what that tells me. Now, then I make a decision. Do I ask about it or do I file that away until I ask some other things and learn more about it? These kinds of subtle things, again, are very hard to get an agent to fully understand how to do. And finally, how to prioritize when you have competing principles. It's very nice to say have a learning mindset. It's very nice to say, control the frame of the negotiation. You should do both. But what if you have to choose? What if somebody comes into the negotiation and makes a completely extreme offer, a ridiculous offer? Well, the learning mindset says you might want to ask some questions. Oh, hey, where did you come up with that number? Can you give me some more information? But there's a problem with that advice. As you're asking questions about how they came up with that number, you're also letting the frame set in. You don't sound like somebody who's not okay with that number, and they may start getting more and more anchored to it. So you might also want to push back on the number. How do you jointly optimize for competing principles? Some of these things are what we're trying to fix when we're trying to create something that will be an advisor that can do all these things. Because clients, a person using an AI agent, is not necessarily a great prompt engineer. They don't always know how to guide the foundation model, but they shouldn't have to be. We're trying to create something that will be amazing at doing all of these things. So as you think about these things, this gets me, and I'm going to stop here. We're at 45 minutes. Um, what's being built here and what's going to be available relatively soon is something called Kilmer AI or Kilmer. And the idea is, can we get an advisor across any kind of context to be able to take some of these core ideas that make us more effective negotiators and help people create more value, help people navigate difficult situations more, whether they're deals or disputes, and turn things that look like unwinnable situations into perhaps things where you can make some progress. With that, I'm going to pause and I will take some questions. There are two links up here. If you're interested in the book, of course, I have to put that link up there. It would be foolish of me not to do that. But also, perhaps more interestingly, if you would be interested in trying out a free beta version of Kilmer when it's available, perhaps in the next few months, just go to that other link and sign up. You can just give your name, email address, etc. And when it's available, if you want to be an early free beta user of it, I'll get in touch with you about it as well. So I'll leave these things up here, and Nicole, I'll let you manage the Q&A.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Deepak, and thank you to everyone who's already submitted questions. So with over 500 attendees, as you can imagine, we have a very active Q&A. So we're going to do our best to get to as many questions. I cannot promise that we will get to everyone's, and I'm going to try to synthesize them. For now, they seem to fall into two buckets. Some are sort of general negotiation questions, including some that are referencing negotiating the impossible specifically, and others are very concentrated on AI. So we'll start with general and then move
Sure.
to AI and perhaps
Sure.
circle back if that makes sense. So we have a number of questions that are centering on the topic of framing, and especially in cases where there are asymmetrical negotiations that are being set up. So, Deepak, if you wouldn't mind, I know you gave us at least one example already of, helping. We have G, we have others who have asked questions. When you're going into an asymmetrical negotiation, what are some of the things that you should be thinking about in order, if you are in the imbalance of power side, to
In the
prepare
weaker side.
that outcome? Yeah.
Got it. A few things. First of all, let's acknowledge the fact that I said, try to control the frame early in the negotiation. Reality is sometimes there's already a pre-established frame. Because of your race, your gender, your age, the size of your company, how young your company is, there's already preconceived notions of you and what you're going to be willing to do and what you deserve, etc. So the very first thing you want to be doing before you walk into negotiation is understanding that. What am I walking into? What's the current default frame of the situation? How are these people like this? And the second thing you want to do immediately then is to say, how do I disrupt that frame? Now, it doesn't mean you go in there and pretend to be something you're not. What you want to make sure you're doing is you're not necessarily following the script. So this is why I gave the examples earlier, right? So if I say, like, hey, if they say, when can you meet? I'll give you an example. They say, okay, hey, you know what? We can talk next week. When are you available? And you don't want to miss out on this opportunity. So the thing that comes out of your mouth is, oh, anytime, just let me know when. Immediately you've signaled to them that you are willing to do anything to make sure that call happens. That is what they expect. So maybe a wiser response might be, hey, listen, next week, how about Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. or sometime Thursday afternoon? If they say yes, great. If they say no, you can always still work out a time. But you want to be mindful of the signal that you're sending when you have that kind of interaction. And then the last thing I would say is, as you're thinking about being in a weaker thing, the thing we often forget as negotiators is that your greatest source of leverage in a negotiation typically is simply your ability to create value for the other side. That is the one thing you never want to lose sight of. That should be at the forefront of your mind, and it should be made at the forefront of their mind. If this negotiation becomes about who's got deeper pockets, who's holding a bigger gun, et cetera, well, that's going to tip the scales in one direction. But if this negotiation can be framed around not just how desperate I am, but what happens to you if this deal doesn't work out? What is the value I'm bringing to the table for you? And what you always want to remind yourself is they're here for a reason. They want to sit down with you for a reason. They think you bring something of value to them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be here. Reminding yourself of that and then framing the negotiation from the perspective of the value you bring to them rather than the bare minimum you need to survive is probably a better approach.
Mm. Great. Thank you so much. We have a question from Jude about what happens when a party is not negotiating in good faith. Is it better to, call them on it, essentially, raise their attention to the fact that they are not doing it, or do you play along and hope that their, underestimating you would be to your benefit ultimately?
So, so I would say sometimes one, not quite two, and I'll explain what I mean by not quite two. So one, do you call them out on it? Sometimes yes. Sometimes the only way people are going to stop behaving a certain way is if you let them know, and then you can decide how diplomatically you need to do it or not, how much leverage you have there or not, how uncalled for it was. But yes, letting them know this behavior won't work is often something that I'll end up advising. But again, with a lot of variation on how you communicate that. Because sometimes if they're just going to lose face and they're going to dig in and they're going to deny it, that may not actually help your cause. But signaling to them that you see this and it's not going to be okay and they're not going to be rewarded for it is crucial. Now, when you don't do that for other reasons, I still wouldn't say play along because play along might be feeding the beast. Play along can just be maybe this is not the time to call it out. Maybe I should get a few more pieces in place before I push back. Maybe I should have some other conversations to learn a little bit more about why they might be doing it. So there may be times where I don't immediately call them out, but it's not, but I'm still trying to make sure I'm not impressing upon them the idea that this is working, that it's great. I'm just trying to strategize before I do something about it. Last thing I'll say on this, sometimes the right thing is to just walk away. Now, maybe you don't have the opportunity, you don't have the option. Sometimes the thing you have to do is disengage. Somebody's at a price point which is completely crazy. They have expectations that you cannot possibly meet. Occasionally, you'll be in a situation where you have to just say to the person, listen, this is just not going to work. Or maybe it's the behavior that's not going to work for you. In those situations, if you still think value could have been created with them, think ahead to how you might re-engage with them and under what conditions, and make sure that that is made clear to them as well. And give them a face-saving way of coming back to you when the time is right. Listen, if you want to shop around, go ahead, shop around. If you leave it at that, or like if this is how you're going to behave, there's no deal. I'm sorry, we're walking away. If you leave it at that, when they wake up one day and realize they shouldn't have behaved that way, or the market doesn't quite give them the money, the deal that they expected, they're going to want to call you up. But on that day, they're going to hesitate because you walked away, told them to take a hike, and now they're going to look sheepish, weak, desperate, embarrassed to call you. If you care about that, if you care about them still coming back to you, put that as part of your strategy. When you walk away, you say something like, listen, why don't you shop it around? And you know what? Let's talk in 3 weeks. Let's just put something on the calendar right now. We'll discuss and we'll see if there's, if things have changed on either of our ends. That suddenly lowers the bar for that conversation happening and allows there to be perhaps some value creating opportunities in the future.
Yeah, great. Very helpful. All right, last general question, then we'll turn to some AI ones from Catherine. Catherine says, and I would have to agree, how would you ever know when you considered all the interest constraints, alternatives, perspectives? Because this could be an infinite path of
Yeah.
preparation. So
Yeah.
when can you feel that you have successfully gone to the end of that?
Yeah. So yeah, bells won't ring, flowers won't fall from the heaven when you've thought a lot about it. The biggest mistake, I think, first is that people don't even consciously think about doing this above and beyond what's being sent to them. So I know a lot of people who talk a lot of negotiations. I know almost nobody who asks enough questions in a negotiation. That the ratio of question marks to periods, that's the thing. So what you can control is the input. You can't be sure of the output. So if you start asking more questions, if you start being more aware of the idea that I need to understand their interest, constraints, alternatives, and perspective, you start moving down that path. A couple of things are going to happen. One, naturally, you're going to move in the right direction. You're going to get more information. Secondly, you're going to find that there's other questions that are suddenly becoming visible that weren't visible before. And at some point, you're going to stop and you're going to satisfy something. You're going to say, you know what? I have enough to be able to make a reasonable strategic decision. And so the last thing you do at that point is to keep in mind there still might be other things that happen. So you're not closed to learning. You still have that learning mindset, but at some point you have to make a decision. But if you haven't gone through each of these, if you don't, if you don't end up with a deal, that's fine. The thing I don't like is when somebody shows up and says, "Oh, we worked on this negotiation, it didn't work out." And I say, "Oh, what happened?" And they say, "I still have no idea what they wanted. I still have no real idea about what went wrong." That to me is a problem. And so even if you're not going to get a deal, my advice to folks always is negotiations should end either with a yes or an answer to the question, why not? So even if you can't get a deal, you want to end the conversation either with, okay, or either you get the deal, or you want to end it with a conversation about, what could have been different. Imagine a world where we were doing a deal and, create an image for me. What would that world look like? So that you're learning as much as you can, even as you walk away. That mindset will just push you in the right direction, but you'll never know if you're 100% there, nor should you expect to be. That's not the goal.
Yeah, great. Thank you. All right, turning to some AI focused questions. We have multiple people, Kunal, Duong, others who are asking the question of, if we were in a place where we have AI agents negotiating on behalf of humans, what is your prognosis for how this will ultimately end if bots have taken over, this is not context specific, but how are
Sure.
we going to ever ensure that somebody gets the upper hand and makes it fair? And what does that look like? How should we think about that process? Because I think for a lot of
Yeah.
people, it's very daunting.
Yeah. So there's going to be stages, right? So for the foreseeable future, humans are going to be in the loop in some way. And if in no other way, and this is a point that I make in the second edition of the book, is as long as humans are still the reason why negotiations are happening, like it is the human interests that are being pursued by agents, we have some seat at the table. So if that ever changes, we're in some sort of future world which none of us can really have any predictions about. That would be. Until then, the stages we're probably going to go through are going to be a mix of agents doing simple negotiations, and we're okay with it because the stakes are either low or the outcomes are very easy to measure and reverse, etc. As we start getting into more complex negotiations, humans stay in the loop. There'll be touch points. There'll be ways to decide whether this agreement is good or not. The AI agents may do some of the work, maybe eventually most of the work or all of the work, but humans will still be able to decide. There's another stage that I think might come. And here we're going to have to sort of like get a little bit imaginative, but it's not the first time humans have gone through this. There may come a time where a lot of things that we currently think of as negotiated outcomes become outcomes that are quote unquote negotiated through agents in a way that is just a different way in which agreements get achieved. So, for example, when we go from bartering, back in the day to having money, it changes the way in which things happen. When you go to Starbucks, and you decide to buy a cup of coffee, it's maybe not in the same way that somebody would have bought coffee beans many, many years ago. We're sort of price takers. There's these mechanisms. Our colleague Guhan Subramanian, who talks about auctions versus negotiations versus market pricing. Like there's different ways in which these things can happen. More recently, the advent of things like blockchain. There's a lot of blockchain enthusiasts who say a lot of the ways in which economic and social things are going to be eventuated are just going to be totally different. So there may come a time, this is sort of beyond the next 5 to 10 years probably, where a lot of the things that we currently think of as negotiable and negotiated between people end up having outcomes that are created by other mechanisms.
Mhm.
I'm not too worried about that. I'm really just worried about how quickly human beings will get comfortable with a situation where they cannot see what's happening inside the box. And the degree to which they can control the ultimate outcome is getting less and less. And yes, if you're a dystopian type of person, what happens in a world where human interests are not the only ones that are being pursued? That would be the ultimate bad thing. Oh,
Yeah.
maybe bad.
Yeah, thank you. All right, we're going to have two more questions and then we will wrap up. We might go over 1 minute.
Mhm.
In fact, your last answer and the premise of it is about a world that is just changing that we can't predict. And one of the things that you address in this new edition of the book is a world that's even changed since the first edition came out, and specifically with the issue of polarization, which we might have thought was bad before, but seems to be just on an ever increasing spiral now. And so I'd just love for you to touch on, I know we won't be able to go into it in a deep way, the role of empathy in a society that is increasingly polarized, because I think it's one of the most powerful pieces of this new edition.
Yeah, and thank you for that. So, I think the most people that we know, presumably everybody on this webinar, is more or less an empathetic person. We're generally empathetic, but at least in my experience, we tend to forget to be empathetic in situations where it matters most. And it actually matters most when we're dealing with somebody who we can't stand. We're dealing with somebody who sees the world completely different from us in a way that we don't just find bizarre, but perhaps unethical. It doesn't mean that you empathize. Oh, you know what? They probably have a point of view. I'll agree with them. You may still want to fight them. You may still want to pressure them in a certain way. You still might want to engage with them in a way but what you don't want to lose sight of the fact is that empathy matters most when you're dealing with people who deserve it least. That is when it is most powerful because that is what gives you the leverage you need to decide, well, can we find a non-violent way out of this? Can we find a value creating opportunity? Can we find a way for both sides to get what they want without doing too much damage? And if no, 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 you still reserve the right to fight it out. You still and even then, if you empathize, you're probably going to have a better understanding of how to fight. So the as we become more polarized, a baseline thing that we should be thinking about it is, well, it's not one person I'm disagreeing with. I'm disagreeing with an entire millions of people who see the world differently from me. It can't just be that they're all insane. They just see the world differently for some reason. Let me try to understand the building blocks of how they see these things. That gives me more opportunities. So empathy is not something that we should do to be nice. Empathy is what we should do to be smart. It is not the tool of like the weak and the subservient. Empathy is the tool of the smart, strategic person who wants to strategize more effectively and possibly find better ways forward. So as things get worse, I think that matters more. And of course, getting the process right and the framing right, of course, is always equally important. But I think the empathy piece becomes more important.
Yeah, I love that and really encourage everybody. This is a very powerful part of this new edition. All right, I know we're 2 minutes over time already, but I'm going to ask one last question because it's
Sure.
been posed by a very good friend of mine. This is a
Oh,
book called Negotiating the Impossible. And so Ricardo wants to know, what is the most difficult negotiation, Professor Malhotra, that you've ever been in? What can you tell us about it? And how did you prevail?
well, let's not assume we prevail. It's tough. So I'll say it in a way that hopefully is the most authentic way I can answer this question. So I'm going to get a little bit real here. So uh, I've been in a lot of business deals, million, billion dollars, multi-billion dollars, a lot of complex deals, some that go great, some that you're not sure how it went, but you feel pretty good about, and some are pretty hard and they go a long time. But a lot of the work that I do, that's my pro bono work, is on armed conflict. You know, war and peace, diplomatic crises, ceasefires, these kinds of things. And those are always more complex because unlike in a business deal where it's like, okay, there's a lot of money on the table, let's figure out how much there is and let's see if we can get our share of it. Um, when you're dealing with these situations, it's not like you're going in there saying, well, we're going to succeed. Now let's see how much we're going to succeed. It's like sometimes your job is to bring the failure rate down from 99% to 95%. You're still going to fail, but you're trying to fail smarter. You're trying to fail better so that a month from now, a year from now, 5 years from now, you're going to be in a better position when somebody else or you are going to run with it. The next time you're going to be in better position. So sometimes that's hard because you're not able to walk away from it saying, look at all the success. Sometimes what you have to just get your mind to do is acclimate to the idea that the objective is something different. We're trying to fail smarter. We're trying to fail with less damage, etc. And the last thing I'll say here, you know, imagine like you're negotiating a business deal and you have an idea. Nicole says, hey, listen, I have a strategy. I think it's going to get me $10 million. And I say, hey, Nicole, that's a great idea. But here's the thing. I have another strategy where you might lose that 10 million, but I can get you 40 million. You'll be like, sweet, let's do that. That's 30 million more. Now imagine a different environment where somebody comes to you and says, hey, we have this ceasefire that we're negotiating in this village or in this town or in this region of a country. But we're having trouble getting the ceasefire to really happen. Can you help us with that ceasefire? Like, help us sort of overcome these barriers. Now, you look at the situation and you say, you know what? My analysis is that you shouldn't even be doing the ceasefire. Not because ceasefires aren't good, but because most ceasefires fall apart. And when they fall apart, sometimes things get worse rather than even than they were before. So instead of doing the ceasefire now, maybe we should wait 3 to 6 months when we can get a broader coalition of people and make a better ceasefire that maybe covers the entire country. Maybe just assume that's your analysis. Now, if that's your analysis, what you should be doing next is advising the head of state or whoever is the foreign minister, whatever it might be that's asking, this national security advisor. Here's my advice. But there's a problem. If they follow what you say and they do it, there's now going to be somebody who dies next week who wouldn't have died otherwise. Now, your hope, of course, is that more people will live. That's the only reason you're giving that advice. But this is not like a business deal. You can't just subtract them out. You can't just say, well, we lost 10, but we got 40, so 30, I'm good. I'm not good. So when you find yourself in situations like that, just sort of conceptually, it is very hard. Those are very hard because I don't know how to do that math. I was pretty good in math as I was growing up. I can't do that math. Now, of course, you can. You can be a very utilitarian about it and say, this is greater than this, and then just move on. It's hard because you sit there going, that's somebody's child, that's someone's spouse or sister or brother or grandparent. You don't even know who they are, but in expectation, because there's not a ceasefire, somebody will. It will happen. And then you find yourself in a situation where you say, why am I even doing this? Like, this is not what I was signing up for. But then if you're not willing to do that, then you shouldn't be in the room in the first place. So when it comes to what's difficult, I mean, I've done so many business deals of so many kinds, and I'm not going to say everyone was like super successful, that we never made any mistakes. I'm sure we made a number of them at various times. These are situations where even when you don't make a mistake, it's very hard. And I don't have a good answer to that. And I don't want to have a good answer to that. I think it's incumbent upon us to feel terrible sometimes when we find ourselves dealing with terrible situations. Otherwise, we may become too robotic, too sort of calculative, to the point where we lose part of our humanity. So I think that keeping that, I think, is worth it a little bit.
Beautiful answer to a very tough question. Thank you so much, Professor Malhotra,
You're
for
welcome.
all of your time today. Thank you to everyone who joined us. I know we went a little bit over our planned time, but we had so many questions. I'm sorry I couldn't ask all of them. Deepak is very active on LinkedIn, so I saw some really great questions in there. Please feel free to ask him, especially about the
Feel free to reach out to me
CPR.
on LinkedIn if you
Yeah,
want. It's an easy
absolutely.
thing to do.
Absolutely. I will say
Yeah.
we are pausing our events for a little bit for the summer, but we will be back shortly with other free live events. Otherwise, we look forward to welcoming some of you at our programs, either online or in person in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Wishing everybody a really great start to your summer if it's summer where you are. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you to the staff. See everybody very soon.
Your PON. Appreciate it. Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.